Hello and welcome to the second part of my series on the French 1935A and 1935S pistols. In the first episode we had a thorough look at the 1935S, so now time to look at the 1935A. And because we mentioned this one, we also of course have to mention the SIG P.49 or 210, because there are quite a number of significant changes starting from this one to reach this one. So let's first talk about the inventor of this pistol, Charles Gabriel Peter. He was Swiss, born in Canton of Vaud, and he finished his education studying engineering at the Zurich Technical University. And his first job was already putting him in a career path for armaments, because he worked for Krupp in Germany. After that, he settled down in France, and he was there when war were declared, and he decided to enlist in the Foreign Legion, where apparently he showed extreme courage and showed his mettle in the finest traditions of Swiss mercenaries, including at least 3 citations. Also during that time he was naturalised French. After the war he continues his engineering career and enters the Lewis Arms Company. There he gradually rises through the ranks until he becomes Director General, and he holds that post until the Lewis Company closes its doors in 1931. It's after the demise of the Lewis Company that Charles Peter turns his attention to the creation of a new semi-automatic pistol, which would then become the 1935A. Now, the idea is entirely his, but he does have support of the Société Alsacienne de Construction Mécanique, S.A.C.M, and it's under their tutorage that the pistol sees the light of day. And they then put him in charge of a newly created unit, which is responsible for precision engineering and armaments, and he is therefore of course perfectly placed when the pistol is adopted to oversee the production of the first series. Now S.A.C.M was already at the time a very well established company. It's one of these oldie-timey engineering firms that produced machinery for the entire spectrum of civilian industry. So they were producing motors, bits for locomotives, printing presses, weaving machines, electrical components, so why not guns? Having overseen the implementation of the production line and seen the first series produced at the age of 60 in 1940, Charles Peter takes a well-deserved retirement and returns to Switzerland. Now, concerning production, as I indicated in the first part of the series, up to 1939 about 10,000 are produced and delivered. After the armistice, the production line is under German control, and during the occupation a further 23,000 are produced. So it's not uncommon to find these with a squashed birdie stamped onto the frame, and the foreign firearm code, the German foreign firearm code for this pistol is 625F. So after the war, the liberation, the production line just carries on, and they carry on producing pistols up until the closure of the S.A.C.M at the end of the 1950s, with a total of about 85,000 pistols produced. So let's have a closer look at the pistol itself. So just like the S, it is a semi-auto pistol chambered in 7.65 long, and it works using the Browning short recoil mechanism, and it has a removable lock plate. Now, these 2 points were requirements for the trials, so no surprise that the 2 pistols share those features. Apart from that, that's about all the 2 have in common. I've seen it sometimes written that the S is a simplified, cheaper version of the A, but if you compare them mechanically, it's clearly not the case. Alright, let's do a bit of disassembly. That's very simple in the classic mode. Pull back the slide a little. Not as far as the S, because there's an additional notch in the slide. Let's pull out the pin. And the 2 bits come apart. So once again we have a recoil spring captive on the guide rod, and here we have a slight difference in the barrel profile. So this is more of a classic Colt 1911 with 2 additional lugs here on the front. How it differs, however, is that we have 2 parallel linkages. Why this was done, maybe it was to avoid infringing. I didn't bother Saint-Etienne, but this is how it is. So 2 parallel links instead of a central one. And on the slide we have the safety here at the back. So once again it's a simple firing pin block, just prevents the hammer from hitting the back of the firing pin. And upon reflection, since making the last vid, this may be a reason why the SMI is as it is, why they changed the safety. Far more of these have been produced and were in circulation by the time the S production really kicks off. So it may have been simply to avoid confusion, whether you got issued one pistol or the other, that they had the safety more or less in the same place and operating in the same way. Alright, let's have a look at the frame and what's going on in here. So the link between the trigger and the sear, you can just see the nose of the sear peeking up there, is done by a stirrup, like a Colt 1911, but unlike the Colt 1911, it is at an angle. Now this is not just a whimsical decision, there is a reason for that. So it's not parallel to the bore axis. And then we'll have a look at the lockwork. Now, I've seen this also referred to, oh yeah, it's like a TT33 or a TT30. Well, yes, the fact that it's removable is sure like one of those, but that is where the similarity stops. The internals are completely different. Right, so as to what's actually going on in here, you can't really get a clear picture, so we shall move over to a nice diagram and I'll explain exactly what's going on. So here we are, and here we have a nice glimpse into the genius of Charles Petter, because the lockwork is extremely simple and we only need one coil spring to drive everything. So we have one spring that does both the reset of the sear and also the driving of the hammer. So this coil spring here is compressed, in a compressed condition at all times, and we've got one end that pushes against the sear and the other end pushes against the washer, which is connected to the rod and linked to the hammer. Now, with the hammer cocked, when you pull the trigger, the sear rotates upwards, which means that the hook at the back starts to slide down the sear notch in the hammer. This, of course, also slightly compresses the spring even further. And once the sear slips the hammer, the spring is then free to push downwards, and then it drags the connection rod and, of course, the hammer. So like the S, this also has a magazine safety because reasons, and it works very, very simply. Contrary to the S, we have this leaf spring here, which has a little wedge on the end. We can see there shining in the darkness, and this is pushing the stirrup downwards. So it's pivoting it down, which means it cannot come into contact with the tip of the sear. And when you load a magazine, you can see the top there, the feed lips come into contact with that wedge, and it slowly and pushes it out of the way. And you can see there. Pushes it out of the way and allows the sear to rise to its functioning position, and there it can come into contact with the sear and you can fire. So what about the disconnector? Because here we've got absolutely nothing that could have this function. Well, once again, we have simplicity itself at work. What we have here is a little cutout in the breech block in the slide, and what's particularly relevant is this camming surface here on the front end. So remember that the stirrup is at an angle, so when you pull the trigger, it actually sticks out a fair bit above the level of the guide rails. So what happens under recoil, the slide shoots back, this camming surface pushes against the stirrup, and you have disconnection. That's it. Two final things I forgot to mention. Firstly, the hammer is non-rebounding, so when you pull the trigger and then release it, the hammer stays firmly up against the back of the firing pin. And secondly, sights fixed at the back, a tiny little narrow U-notch, and at the front it is adjustable for windage, but once again, very small, very narrow, and pretty good when you're taking your time for competition, and these shoot very, very well if you have the time, but to get a quick combat sight picture, these are actually terrible. So I'll finish off by doing a little comparison between the P.49, 210 and the 1935A. Now I'll leave aside the basic ergonomic differences because they're blindingly obvious. So we'll start with the guiding of the slide. The 35A has external rails, so the slide slides along rails on the outside of the frame, whereas the 210 has internal guide rails. You can clearly see the difference there. And you wouldn't believe the number of people who have sworn blind that that feature was originally on the 35A. Well, they can swear on their like, it's not true. The second interesting change is the way that the barrel is tilted. So now we no longer have a linkage, and we have what we now is pretty much the standard these days. We have a camming groove in here, in which the slide stop pin is fixed, and under recoil we have then lowering of the barrel, tilting of the barrel. The little difference is that we now have a feed ramp integral to the barrel. It's not necessary in the 35A because the cartridges are more or less presented directly in the bore axis. So in here in the SIG they're slightly lower, so we need of course the feed ramp to guide the bullet into the chamber. So the final difference, and perhaps the most important, is the complete rework, overhaul of the lockwork. Now they look pretty similar, but this has two extra pieces which are vital for improving the trigger pull, because frankly the trigger pull on the 35A sucks. It's very long and very mushy, and I've had two of these, so sample of two, both meh. And in fact you can see that the notch here is pretty deep, and that could be reworked if you so wanted to, but I'm not going to touch it. And that means you have to drag the sear an awful long way before it releases. So yeah, long, horrible, mushy trigger. What we have here, we have an extra sear spring. So the sear now has its own independent spring. You're not having to fight against the main spring. And we have an extra pivoting plate, which we can just see in here. And you can see the front side of it here. And this allows you to fine-tune this two-stage trigger. So we shall now go over to an official SIG document, which is sort of a guide for gunsmiths on how to adjust that. So here's a document with a lovely, useful section of the lockwork. So we have the S-shaped sear at the top, which now has its own independent little coil spring. So for most of the trigger pull, you're just fighting against that. And we have this pivot plate underneath. Now that has two little legs at the front, which is what we could see on the outside of the lock, and they're pushing against the housing. And hidden in the middle are two little ramps. And so everything is parallel. You have two of each. And you can shorten these two parts to change the trigger pull. So if you shorten the legs at the front, this means that the ramps are in closer proximity to the bottom of the sear. This means that when you pull the trigger, sear comes into contact with the swivel plate quicker. And this means then you start fighting against the mainspring. So you have this second stage comes sooner and is harder because the rest of the time you're going to have to drag the sear against the mainspring. And in the inverse direction, if you shorten the two ramps there in the middle, the distance is then greater between this pivot plate and the sear, which means that for most of the travel you're going to be fighting just against the little sear spring. Some people make it such that these two ramps are so short that in fact the sear never contacts the swivel plate, so you just get a single stage trigger. And I freely admit that I had no idea that this extra pivoting plate was actually present in the lock. I mean, I knew it was there because I'd seen it, but I didn't know how it worked. It was only when my second stage disappeared during a competition suddenly that our pet gunsmith, Robert, patiently explained what had happened and how to remedy it. Now, we don't know whether this was common wear and tear or if the pressure points had already been fiddled about with, and that would cause then it to wear out quicker than it should have. So here we are at the end of part 2. I hope that during this series I was able to convey the differences between these two pistols, and perhaps also hopefully correct a few misconceptions about both. So thank you once again for your attention. Thank you for your support, whatever platform you wish to follow us on. And again, see you maybe next time here in the workshop or at the range. Bye.